a rich and stately carved cross, whereon her statue shall with glory shine, and henceforth see you call it Charing Cross. So in this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about Charing Cross. I was thinking about Charing Cross because when I lived in London, I worked right off of Charing Cross, a building called the Adelphi Building, which was kind of off towards the Strand, off down towards the river. And my underground station was Charing Cross or Embankment, either one. It was midway between the two. I would also grab my lunch around Charing Cross as well. And after work, I used to walk up Charing Cross Road and poke around in all of the bookshops of Charing Cross Road. And that whole area around Trafalgar Square is such an interesting part of London, and it has so much history. I mean, all of London has so much history, but that area in particular is just a real wealth of history. So for those of you who have not been to London, Charing Cross is right at the bend of the river, in between Westminster and the City of London, right where the river makes this 90-degree bend. And it kind of is the midpoint between going south to Westminster and then heading east to the city itself. And then you can go straight up north towards Highgate and Hampstead and Camden, the area. If you follow Charing Cross Road up north, then it turns into Tottenham Court Road, heads to Euston, and up you go. Or you can turn to the west and head towards Buckingham Palace, the whole area around Soho, and heading out from there towards eventually Notting Hill. And so Charing Cross is right in the middle of all of this, right? And now it's famous because of Nelson's Column right in the middle of Trafalgar Square, the National Portrait Gallery, the National Gallery, St. Martin's in the Field. All of that stuff is right in Trafalgar Square. So it's a super busy place. And it was always a busy place. So Charing Cross was actually this junction in London where 6 routes met. The routes I was just telling you about, from the north, from the east, from the west, they all met right in Charing Cross. And the original Charing Cross was one of the medieval Eleanor Crosses that stood right in the heart of the hamlet. It was its own little, tiny little area called Charing from the 1290s until 1647, when during the English Civil War, all of those sorts of popery and anything that wasn't completely Protestant and Puritan was destroyed. So the Eleanor Crosses are really interesting. It was this series of 12 tall, decorated stone monuments topped with these crosses that went down in this line right down the eastern part of England. And Edward I had them built between 1291 and 1295, a 4-year period, in memory of his most beloved wife, Eleanor of Castile. She died in November of 1290. And these crosses were placed in the areas where she rested along the route taken when her body was transported to London. So I suppose it wasn't her resting, but the people who were carrying her body. It took 12 days to bring her body from Lincoln down to London where she was buried. So these crosses were erected at each of the places where her body stopped, starting at Lincoln, and it went down Northamptonshire, Buckinghamshire, Bedfordshire, Hertfordshire, and then eventually Cheapside and Charing, now Charing Cross, in Westminster. There are still 3 that survive more or less intact, but the other 9 are completely gone. The largest and the biggest, the most ornate one of them all was the Charing Cross. So the name of the area, Charing, actually comes from an old English word, shearing, which refers to a bend in the river. There apparently is a theory that it comes from Charing, which means dear queen in French, but that hamlet already existed before Eleanor's death. It has been there since at least the 11th century with that name. So it doesn't really work to have that theory. But the name Cross was added to Charing's name after that cross went up. By the late 14th century, it's referred to as Charing Scrúcha, which I completely butchered that because I can't really speak Middle English, but that was the variant by the late 14th century. And now when you leave the Charing Cross station, it's a major railway station, there is a 70-foot high sculpture in front of the station that was built in 1865. It was kind of a reimagining of what the original would have looked like, but it's not on the original site and it's not based on the original. So Charing itself did play a role in Tudor history. There are a couple of major things to talk about with the village of Charing, the hamlet of Charing. In the 13th century, sometime between 1232 and 1236, there was a chapel and hospital founded there after St. Mary Roncesvalles. And it was in land at the corner of modern Whitehall and down towards a wharf by the river. It was an Augustinian house tied to a mother house in the Pyrenees. In 1379, that house and lands were seized for the king under a statute for the forfeiture of the lands of schismatic aliens. They fought that action and did get some of their rights back, but in 1414, Henry V suppressed these houses again, and the priory fell into a decline. And they also started having arguments about the collection of tithes with the parish church of St. Martin in the Fields. There is still, of course, a St. Martin in the Fields on the northern side of Trafalgar Square, close to where the original one would have been. It's not the original church that's there now. However, they do have very good classical music concerts. They're quite touristy. It's a lot of Vivaldi Four Seasons, popular stuff. But if you're visiting and you want to enjoy some good music, you can do that. They also have a good cafe in the crypt. So recommend that if you're visiting. But for the purposes of our time period, in 1541, religious artifacts that were collected during the dissolution of the monasteries were moved to St. Margaret's. And the chapel was adapted as a private house, and its almshouse was sequestered to the royal palace. So it became linked to the royal palace, and it was a place where they started storing some of these old relics and artifacts that they were taking from the monasteries. And interesting, this is also after Cromwell's time. So probably some of those things were taken from the people who started replacing him during the dissolution. And then 13 years later, there was Wyatt's rebellion going on. This was when Thomas Wyatt tried to overthrow Mary I of England after she ascended to the throne and to replace her with Lady Jane Grey. And it was the event that was pretty much the final nail in the coffin for Lady Jane Grey. As long as Jane was still alive, there was going to be somebody that Protestants were going to rally around. And so Mary felt that after having been lenient with Lady Jane, she was going to have to kill her. But in 1554, Charing Cross was the site of the final battle of Wyatt's rebellion. Wyatt's army had come from Kent. London Bridge had been barred to them. They crossed the river by what was then the next bridge upstream at Hampton Court. And so then they started coming on the northern side of the river from Hampton Court that brought them down St. Martin's Lane right to Whitehall. The palace at Whitehall was defended by 1,000 men under Sir John Gage, based at Charing Cross. They retreated within Whitehall after firing their shot, causing consternation within, thinking that the force had changed sides. And then the rebels, fearful of artillery on the higher ground around St. James's, did not press their attack, and they marched onto Ludgate, where they were then met by the Tower garrison and surrendered. Now, the area right to the north of Charing Cross was all farmland. When you look at the old maps of London and Westminster, that whole area is farmland. And there's actually a legend that the term Soho, which is just to the north and west, was a hunting cry for when Henry VIII would go out hunting into the woods and the fields that were there. I don't know if that's true or not, but I have heard that they would go, Soho, Soho. But running directly north is Charing Cross Road. If you're a Harry Potter fan, you've heard of Charing Cross Road because I think the night bus goes straight up Charing Cross Road. And so it featured in some of the Harry Potter books. And it's an area that's famous for all of the different bookshops. There's lots and lots of wonderful independent bookshops. And then just to the east is Bloomsbury, where a lot of the publishers are located. So it's a very literary area. But at that time, it would have been simply fields and forests and open land for the people who lived in and around Westminster and on the western side of the city to be able to graze animals and grow their crops. So I hope you enjoyed this little trip back in time to Charing Cross in London. The next time you're in London, also make sure you get off at the Charing Cross tube station because it has these lovely murals along the side showing the journey of the Eleanor Cross, which makes a lot more sense once you know the story behind it.